Morning, everyone. Today's reading is from John chapter 12, verses 1 to 8, and I'm reading from the NIV. The heading is Jesus Anointed at Bethany. Verse 12. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, a keeper of the money bag he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me.
Morning, everyone. Today I'm going to tell you a story, a love story, involving Jesus and two of his closest friends. It's not a story of romantic love, but of another kind, somewhat undefinable, but still love, a deep love of mutual devotion. The story is told across 3 passages in the Bible, the final of which was just read. But we will start with the 2 earlier encounters in Luke 10 and John 11, that provide more context for this final scene and enable us to understand more about who Jesus is and how he connected with the story's 2 key characters, sisters Mary and Martha. Whilst there is much that can be surmised from these relatively short passages, there is still much that is left unsaid. And sometimes what is not said is just as important as what is. So I'm going to fill in some of the gaps with my limited understanding of the cultural context and from my lived experience. And that is of someone who was raised in the church and has walked with Jesus for a long time, but who has still experienced significant hardships and even harm throughout this journey. And from my experience as a GP, working with other women with their own trauma histories. These are the lenses through which I interpret these passages. It's my perspective. But as one of my favourite authors says, the more stories and perspectives we share, the closer we come to an approximation of truth. And I think this is how God designed the church to function too. It's how we come to appreciate God most fully. So I hope my perspective adds to your understanding of of God and how he wishes to relate with us. Let's start with the first passage in Luke 10, where we are introduced to the siblings, Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Jesus and his disciples were sharing a meal with them in their home in Bethany, which was a small village about 2 hours' walk outside of Jerusalem. It's clearly not the first time they've met, because there's already an ease and informality between them that suggests they know each other well, and it's likely that Jesus stayed with them often as they travelled to and from Jerusalem. In the next passage, John states that Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And given that John described himself as the one Jesus loved, He seems well qualified to have recognised that there was a special level of intimacy between them. It is thought that if they owned a home large enough to accommodate Jesus and his disciples, the family was probably wealthy. But even so, they appeared not to have been spared significant suffering, because the house was described as belonging to Martha, and she was acting as the primary host, which suggested she didn't have a husband. Whilst it's possible Martha had never married and was independently wealthy, it is far more likely that she was a widow and that her parents had also died, given that Mary and Lazarus lived with her, possibly as the older sister in the family. In this encounter, Martha was stressed and distracted by the demands of entertaining the disciples, whilst Mary sat at the feet of Jesus listening to him. Martha approached Jesus in exasperation, exclaiming, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all of the work by myself? Tell her to help me." I don't know a lot about first century Middle Eastern gender relations, but I am quietly confident that it was not okay for a woman to interrupt a respected rabbi whilst he was teaching. Jesus, however, didn't mind that, but he was concerned about what was really going on for Martha, and he confronted her whilst defending Mary. He started very tenderly with, "Martha, Martha," before continuing, "You are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." I feel such compassion for Martha in that moment. She was already extremely stressed, with adrenaline surging through her body, before being compared unfavourably with her younger sister in front of her guests. I think we've all probably had similar experiences to enable an understanding of how painful that would have been. I know how I would have replied, and I'm certain that Martha would have reacted very strongly too. But Luke, in the passage, very graciously didn't record her response. I find it interesting that Jesus did this at all, given that he was well aware of another time that God unfavourably compared two siblings, the first siblings in the Bible, Cain and Abel. Long story short, Cain killed Abel. First siblings, first murder. But it's important to understand what issue Jesus was addressing in this exchange. Jesus wasn't chastising Martha for being too busy, too bossy, too demanding, or just too much. She might have heard those accusations from others, but would never do so from Jesus. He was instead asking her to slow down, to stop worrying. If Martha had done this, she would have realised that if Jesus was able to feed the crowd of 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, he would certainly have been able to handle the catering on that occasion. Jesus' rebuke was in fact an invitation to Martha to allow him to take charge so that she could spend time with him. I imagine what Jesus was asking of Martha wasn't easy for her. Given that she had likely lost her parents and her husband, she had learnt that life can go terribly wrong very quickly, and so she strove to always stay in control. It also seems probable that even as a child, she held adult household and caregiver responsibilities. And I've observed that children who are parentified in this way don't bear these responsibilities easily when they reach adulthood. They often overfunction to cope with the sense of overwhelm they carry from childhood. Jesus knew both the perils of comparing siblings and Martha's specific vulnerabilities, but I believe he also knew Martha well enough to trust that, although she may immediately react angrily, she would receive his correction as he intended it with time. And we see in the next passage that his trust was not misplaced. Then we come to Mary. When I've heard others preach on this passage over the years, Mary is often portrayed as an idealised version of Christian womanhood, sitting serenely and submissively at Jesus' feet. But this ignores one important point, that Martha wasn't wrong. In that context, Mary should have been helping her. But she was knowingly ignoring her responsibilities, and undoubtedly Martha's increasing agitations and angry looks her way, while she chose to sit and listen to Jesus, even positioning herself as one of his disciples, which was very uncommon in that culture. Mary was, at that moment, stubbornly defying so much of what was socially expected of her, or even considered acceptable. Given all of this, Mary's choice was risky. It required significant courage. And I wonder what drove this. Over and over again in the Bible, we observe other women risking rejection and even punishment to place themselves at Jesus' feet. The unclean woman who had persistent uterine bleeding, the prostitute with her alabaster jar, a Canaanite mother whose daughter was demon-possessed, even his own mother at the foot of the cross where he was crucified. These women were all in desperate circumstances with intense needs that only Jesus could meet. And this makes me wonder what Mary might have suffered too, as an orphan, without the protection of her parents. And I doubt that Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet in quiet, calm contemplation, but more likely in desperation too. That brings us to the second passage between Jesus and the siblings that is described in John 11. In this passage, Jesus had become very unwell, and so Martha sent for Jesus knowing that he could heal him. Jesus was probably a day's walk away, but when he heard about Lazarus' illness, he delayed travelling to Bethany for a further 2 days, having decided that he would allow Lazarus to die so that he could raise him from the dead, and in doing so demonstrate that he had power over death. But of course, Mary and Martha were not informed of the plan, and you can imagine their distress as Lazarus rapidly declined and died, whilst Jesus, their close friend and only hope, didn't arrive. When Martha heard that Jesus was finally nearby, she rushed out to meet him, and what followed was an extraordinarily profound conversation. Rushing towards Jesus, she greeted him by saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." This is clearly not the Martha that we observed in the previous passage. The Martha who would have been anguished and agitated with life spiralling out of control. Thus, as painful as Jesus' feedback must have felt at the time, she had clearly embraced and processed it, allowing his words to do the deeper work that was required, and we see the fruit of that in this scene. We see it in her actions even before she spoke. She was not hiding or being standoffish because of a lingering sense of shame from her last encounter with Jesus, but instead she rushed confidently to him. Amid the confusion and grief of her brother's avoidable death, she was not fretting or afraid. There was no accusation or blame this time, just a declaration of absolute faith and trust in Jesus despite the circumstances. In response to Martha's declaration, Jesus replied with what to me is one of the most profound and powerful statements that he made during his ministry years. He said, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." There are 7 times in the Bible that Jesus makes these important I am statements, such as I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, the good shepherd, the way, the truth, and the life. These other statements were all made to groups of people, to the crowds he was teaching, or to his disciples. But this time, and only this time, he made an I am statement to an individual, to his friend, to Martha. And this is important too. But their exchange didn't end there. When Jesus asked Martha if she believed him, she replied, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." This is the same statement that the disciple and later apostle Peter made when Jesus asked him a similar question. And that time Jesus responded by affirming that he would build his church upon Peter's revelation. Peter did become a leader in the early church, and I wonder whether Martha might have too. Meanwhile, as this profound exchange occurred, Mary remained at the house. We don't know whether Mary was aware that Jesus was approaching or why she chose to stay at home. But we do know that she was surrounded by other mourners. And this makes me wonder whether, with her sensitive heart and big emotions, her grief was overwhelming or even immobilizing, and that she chose to stay in the safety and comfort that was most immediately accessible to her. But Martha soon returned home and informed Mary that Jesus was asking for her. Notice that this time Jesus was realigning Mary's position. He didn't want her to sit. He asked her to move, to come to him. And Mary did move. She ran to Jesus, and being Mary, immediately fell at his feet in a flood of tears, repeating the same words as Martha. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But unlike Martha, this was not followed with a declaration of faith, but more tears. When Jesus saw Mary weeping, it says that he was deeply moved, troubled even, despite knowing that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. But even so, Jesus did not try to shush or silence Mary. He did not explain why her tears were unnecessary or tell her that everything would eventually be okay. Nor did he attempt to connect with Mary the way he did with Martha, with her intellect and understanding, but rather with Mary's primary way of connecting, with his heart, with his emotions. I wonder how many times Mary had been scolded for being too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, or just too much. But she would never hear those words from Jesus. In fact, Jesus didn't say anything at all, but instead he wept with her. And we are not left wondering what this meant to Mary because we witness it in the final passage. Of course, Jesus did go to the tomb where Lazarus was buried and, as he'd always planned, raised him to life. But given what had just unfolded beforehand, the resurrection seems more like a footnote in the story of his sister's friendship with Jesus. And finally, we make it to today's reading, the last documented meeting of Jesus and his siblings. Once again, Jesus and his disciples were gathered at Martha's home for dinner in Jesus' honour. Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem again with his disciples, where a week later he would be crucified. I suspect that knowing this, Jesus hadn't visited the siblings to teach or to minister to those present, but to be ministered to rest and recharge in Martha's now unhassled, unhurried hospitality, and in Mary's adoration and devotion. Lazarus, of course, was there too, reclining at the table. Interestingly, he doesn't have a speaking role in any of the scenes, although in fairness to Lazarus, he was dead for some of the story. But even still, he seems to occupy a more supporting role in his sisters' lives. And that's probably exactly what was needed of him, living with two strong, passionate women. I wonder whether Lazarus was the calm, quiet presence in their home, content to serve his sisters by charting a steady course through their sometimes tumultuous seas, creating the safety and scaffolding that they needed to shine. And if this was his role, he would have been just as unconventional and inspiring as his sisters. However, in this scene, the spotlight is solely on Mary. Mary, with her tender spirit and intuitive heart, perhaps sensed more than most that something was stirring, that something significant was about to happen. And she responded accordingly, not with words or revelations like Martha, but with enacted emotion, by pouring a bottle of expensive perfume worth more than a year's wages onto Jesus' feet and wiping them with her hair. An act that would have been viewed as far more than just an inconvenient interruption during dinner, but as indecent. I'm confident that Mary hadn't thought this through at all. I don't think for a second she considered the cost of the perfume or the possible reproof of the disciples. She just surrendered to what she sensed in the moment and to her deep adoration of Jesus, whom she'd learnt through lived experience, understood and accepted her. Every emotion, imperfection, or eccentricity, both her beauty and her brokenness. And he never withdrew from her. He always defended her. And he did so this time when Judas protested too. In a world that had likely been very unkind to Mary, she experienced what it meant to be fully known and fully loved by Jesus. And she loved him fully, even foolishly, in return. And so again, we see Mary position herself at Jesus' feet, always at his feet. This time not to listen and learn, or in desperation or distress, but as an expression of her love for him, as an act of worship, an act that Jesus explained, anticipated, and honoured his approaching burial. I can imagine what Mary's act must have meant to Jesus, not only in that instant, but a week later as he was dying on the cross, deserted by most of his friends and followers. I wonder whether amid the stench of death and decay that surrounded him, the memory of the overpowering scent of Mary's perfume that had filled the home returned to him, and he remembered also Mary's unbridled devotion a devotion so deep that she hadn't counted the cost of her actions, just as Jesus hadn't as he hung on the cross. But I think Mary's act meant more to Jesus than was just mentioned in the passage, because perfume nard was not only used to disguise the scent of death, but to symbolise honour and divine appointment, to anoint kings. Mary's spontaneous act not only prepared Jesus for his death, but also pointed towards his eventual resurrection and reign at the right hand of God. As I consider what I've recently learnt about Mary and Martha, I can identify parts of my personality and giftings that mirror them both. And that's okay, because it's clear from how Jesus embraced the sisters that there is no right way to be a Christian woman. We can be a little or a lot like Mary or Martha, or anywhere in between, depending on our distinctive temperament, the season of life, what God is asking of us in the moment, or even, let's face it, where we're at in our monthly cycle. I hope you all realise that women's reproductive hormones fluctuate like a Big Dipper on a roller coaster, not once, but twice, every month, month after month, year after year, until menopause, when anything can happen. These fluctuations have enormous impact on our emotional state and even cognitive function. It's not an innate weakness, it's pure physiology. In comparison, men's testosterone levels remain flat month after month, year after year, perhaps slightly declining around midlife, but slowly, giving men years to adjust. I do have a point, and that is when I say Lazarus could ideally chart a steady course and create the psychological safety that the women in his life needed to thrive. I'm not just describing what I wish for, although I really do, but how I think God created us to function best together, based on significant biological evidence. And if, as a man, you can't be present this way for your family, then perhaps it's time to acknowledge that without any judgment or blame, and find the help you need to heal. And I am healing too. I need to. Because I see in myself not only Mary and Martha's strengths, but their woundedness too. Sometimes my desire to live a godly life overflows into anxiety and overthinking, or I attempt to navigate life's confusion and complexity with overfunctioning and control. But then the distress swells and I find myself in despair at the feet of Jesus once again. But I'm learning that in whichever state I find myself, I will find Jesus there too. Safe, present, responding to my unique ways of needing him. And I find myself more and more allowing him to love me like that, and to not allow any part of myself to stop me from finding my way to him, or to try and hide these parts of myself when I'm there. And this authenticity is important because, as Brené Brown says in her research, the opposite of belonging is fitting in. When we are pretending, performing, or playing a role in his presence, we cannot genuinely connect. And Jesus said in John 17 that he wants for us to be with him where he is, to be one with him just as he is one with God the Father. It's clear from the story of Mary and Martha that Jesus wasn't interested in editing any part of their personalities or even behaviour that their culture would have labelled unacceptable. Jesus was merely removing any internal obstacles that were preventing them from being fully in his presence. He invited Martha to be still and to sit with him, whilst he asked Mary to move past the paralysis of her pain and to come to him. And he wants the same for us too. He invites us, even today, into that same level of intimacy that he shared with Mary and Martha, into our own unique love story. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you that you are here. You are with us. You're always present with us. And you long to be close to us and long to love us in the way that you do. Thank you for showing us in the story of Mary and Martha how you long to connect to us, how you can connect to us. And I pray that you would continue to remove, in the way that you do, any obstacles that prevent us from fully entering into your presence and your love for us. If you've heard anything today that you would like to respond to, if you're aware of any obstacles or any ways in which you're not as close to Jesus as you would like or as he would like, then I would invite you to respond to, just as he asked Mary and Martha to respond, to sit or to move. Sometimes, as Steve sometimes says, Jesus asks us for a physical response to a spiritual question. And so if it's helpful for you to respond in some way, whether to raise your hand or to ask the person next to you to pray or to come over to the side where there'll be people to pray with you, then I would also invite you to do that as well.